Let's just be clear. Trauma is not about thinking. So like the physiological response of trauma is actually really wise. I mean, it's what our body does to keep us safe in the face of a perceived danger, right? So it doesn't have to be an actual danger to someone. So, this is something also that I work with clients on is, if it feels like a danger to you, it's a danger to you. Right? That's how your body is interpreting it. So it's going to put you in survival mode. And that mode comes on very quickly. So there can be a lot of shame about how we react to certain situations. We do pass trauma down genetically. The important thing to know about that, though, is that it's not a given. So the gene has to be, in a way, woken up or activated by its context. So if you are in an environment where it matches the trauma or something comes that's a similar trigger, then that trauma will emerge. That although trauma feels like it is a huge challenge and can put you in a dark place, that there is always a light, and that the resilience that comes from surviving trauma, the lessons that it gives you, always will lead towards growth. But you can't do it alone. So reach out, find someone, find a therapist, find a friend, find a family member. Don't try to go it alone. Do it with someone, and that's the path to healing.
An exploration of trauma, transformation, and triumph. Your healing starts here. And we are back with another episode of Through the Trauma Podcast. I am Amber, your host, and today I have with me Miss Marcia Bonato Warren. She's a somatic counselor, a licensed therapist, psychotherapist, interculturalist, and an author with over 30 years of cross-cultural mental health experience. She has quite an array of different things that she's done over her career. Thank you so much, Marcia, for coming on today. Marcia, did I say that right?
Yeah, you got it. Yeah. Thank you so much, Amber. Yeah.
Tell my audience a little bit about what you do and all the different things that you've been involved with over the course of your career here.
Thank you, Amber. And it is interesting when I look at my, my where I've gone professionally, and I'm even surprised at, all of the different places I've traveled. I think the best way to explain that is I've always been fairly eclectic, but there's been a through line with my profession. I grew up in Santa Fe, New Mexico. My father is from Santa Clara Pueblo, which is a tribe about half an hour north of Santa Fe, and I'm an enrolled member of that tribe. And my mom immigrated to the States from Brazil as a teacher. She taught Portuguese and Spanish, and that's how my parents met. And I grew up going in between cultures, which is really kind of at the root of the work that I do. Part of what that brought up for me was that since I didn't know the languages of each of my parents, whenever I was immersed in those cultures, I ended up really engaging with those cultures on a nonverbal level. So I was trying to figure out the cultural context I was in, how to understand my relatives, how to understand what was going on, culturally, what the rules were, all those things which are deeply subconscious. So why that factors into what I've done in my life as far as work is I always seem to pursue both, work and educational experiences that had to do with crossing cultures, right? So I wanted to understand that. I wanted to learn that. So my undergraduate degree was in international studies. My first master's was in international relations. I actually didn't get into mental health until as a second career when my kids were younger and I went back to school. But part of that whole experience for me was really working with folks from different cultural identities in a variety of ways. And that's just something I've always been attracted to and I really love. For me, the different way people see the world has always felt very enticing to me because it helped me understand myself as well.
When you say tribe, you're saying like from different areas, or they're kind of native here or stationed here in the U.S. or?
So in the United States, we have over 250 federally recognized tribes. So all over the country, and then we have about over 200 and some Alaska Native villages as well. And of course, Native Hawaiians. And so if you're a federally recognized tribe, it's a sovereign nation within the United States. So if you're an enrolled member of that tribe, there's a way of becoming a citizen of that tribe. Not all Native Americans in the United States are enrolled members of their tribes. They have affiliations, but it depends on each tribe and how they determine what citizenship means for them or what membership means. So, when you hear, like for me, Santa Clara Pueblo, and the word Pueblo is actually a Spanish term, because New Mexico was colonized by the Spaniards. So they gave the tribes that they encountered Pueblo names, but we have our own names, for our own communities. So it's, if you haven't grown up around, tribes and Native Americans, it can be kind of eye-opening to know that within this country, we also have so many other cultures and languages that have been here before the United States and before other colonial entities that were here, and will continue to be here after that time passes too.
So it's very interesting because I grew up in the South, and you hear of like Native Americans. I've never fully understood. Obviously, there's different cultures adopt different things when it comes to trauma and trauma modalities.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So what are you seeing, having grown up in a Native American tribe? What does that look like as far as trauma and trauma modalities?
One of the things that when I started to do research on historical trauma and intergenerational trauma, not just for my book, but like when I was, going through my program at Naropa, which is somatic counseling. So that's body-based psychotherapy. So we're really, bringing the body into therapy, and all of the wisdom and all the stories that it carries with it inherently brings trauma as well, right? And not just present moment trauma or this life experience trauma for the individual, but really like what are our bodies carrying that have been passed down to us from our different cultural lineages, right? And what I found in doing this research is that, and this is, I would invite your listeners to get really curious about this for their heritage as well. There were particular kind of trauma patterns and trauma manifestations in different cultural groups. So for, I would say, Native Americans in general, not necessarily my tribe in particular, but in general, there's a lot of research on historical trauma. One of the folks that I cite in the book is Dr. Bonnie Duran, and she's like one of the foremost researchers on historical trauma. Another researcher is Rachel Yehuda, and she studied Jewish lineage, like Holocaust survivor trauma. So what you'll see in there is not only kind of psychological patterns. So for, I would say for on the Jewish side, what she found was higher levels of anxiety, I think would be one of the things. Hypervigilance, which is also a signature of trauma. I think on the Native side, I'm going to say more along the lines of depression, dissociation, some of those markers of hypoarousal. So I'm going to sound technical here, but I use the window of tolerance from Dr. Dan Siegel, which I find really helpful. And that's where we talk about fight or flight happening in trauma. And then if that doesn't address the trauma, then people go into freeze or fawn responses. So, without getting too much into detail, if you look at the research, then you'll see certain patterns that go along with certain cultural identities. And that actually gives context, when we're working with folks, both as a therapist and for ourselves too, that what we're holding in our bodies and how we experience trauma, yes, it is ours, but it may not be solely ours. It may very well have been passed down to us. The other thing, and we've heard a lot about this in the news, is the boarding school for Native Americans that were taken away from their homes when they were young. And this was over, centuries. That establishment of kind of a trauma pattern, there was abuse that was done at these schools that then lived in these kids. And if they survived and they went back to their communities, they also were victims of abuse. And that's trauma that's then passed down to their families. That affects generations going down the line.
There's a lot that I've been looking at recently about generational trauma. I'm a Christian, so I believe that there is such thing as generational curses that can happen. But I think if we break that down until we take the Christianity out of it, it is generational trauma.
Yeah.
Where people have experienced and then they pass that down and they pass that down. I recently read a book that I thought was very interesting that spoke about how trauma sometimes our bodies hold that trauma and then we can pass that down to our kids, like in the womb. We can pass that down genetically.
Yes.
It can be passed down. What do we do with that?
That's pretty powerful if you think about that. And yeah, what you're saying is right. It's epigenetics. We do pass trauma down genetically. The important thing to know about that, though, is that it's not a given. So the gene has to be, in a way, woken up or activated by its context. So if you are in an environment where it matches the trauma, or something comes that's a similar trigger, then that trauma will emerge. It also gives you the opportunity to heal that, though, right? So if you think about how powerful that is, if we become conscious of it, right, get curious about it, and say that you have a trauma response to a trigger, right? And let's say that's like a fight or flight, like there's a huge amount of anger that comes up around a trigger, right? If we can pause for a moment, and this is like an amazing skill. I know it sounds super simple and it's not, but if we can pause in the moment where we're having a trigger and get curious, right? It's like, oh, okay. Is this mine, right? Or does this feel like it's more than mine? Is this something that I've seen before? Like, did I see my parents do this? Or did I see my community do this reaction in the same way to this particular trigger? I know it sounds really broad. It's easier, I think, if we come up with examples, but like just the pause is really important to bring into our process when we're talking about trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I love that you said that too, because I think that that's the problem, I believe, with a lot of trauma in general, is that we don't want to refill it. You don't want to, it's like, if something feels uncomfortable, the response is, let me get away from this as fast as I can.
Yeah.
I don't want to touch that thing because it's uncomfortable.
Right.
But that's not healthy to do that, I don't think. I think it's very much more healthy to say, hey, sit with that feeling, like you said, get curious about it, but like, feel the feeling. We're human beings, so we have emotions. Feel that feeling, and then be able to see where it comes from, so we can try to fix it, find the modality to fix it. I think this is why it's so important to fix our trauma, or to try to navigate whatever modality or whatever it is that we can try to fix that trauma, knowing that it can be passed down to our kids.
Yeah. It's, we have a lot more agency. We have a lot more choice around our trauma than it would have us believe. And let's just be clear, trauma is not about thinking, so like the physiological response of trauma is actually really wise. I mean, it's what our body does to keep us safe in the face of a perceived danger, right? So it doesn't have to be an actual danger to someone. So, this is something also that I work with clients on is, if it feels like a danger to you, it's a danger to you. That's how your body is interpreting it. So it's going to put you in survival mode. And that mode comes on very quickly. So there can be a lot of shame about how we react to certain situations. And, part of my internship when I was coming through my graduate program, I worked with a fabulous organization in Boulder called Safe House Progressive Alliance for Nonviolence, SPAN. So we worked with domestic violence survivors and victims. And a lot of times what they would find, my clients, is that the way they reacted in the face of a threat, from their abuser was opposite of what they would have wanted to do, right? So, they froze, right? Oftentimes they would freeze, or they would, flee, so they would run, and a lot of times these people were fighters, like in their minds and in their hearts, they wanted to stand up for themselves. And one of the things that we discovered and we talked about was, in that moment, the body already knew that to do another response like fight would have been more dangerous. So freeze was a better option. Flight was a better option. So in that moment, maybe we can't do the pause, right? But afterwards, if you're in, a relationship with a therapist, or you have a good friend and you can kind of unpack that, you can actually give your body props for keeping you safe, right? So it's understanding really what the trauma response is, that it moves quickly, that it really takes our decision making offline for the moment so that we can react and be safe. But that doesn't have to be the only response ever, right? As we become conscious of it and really engage with it, try to understand it and listen to its wisdom, right? Which is the resilience piece of trauma. We talk a lot about trauma and the wounding, but we also have resilience around that. So what are we learning from those moments that we've been kept safe by our bodies, but what else do we want to do with that? What's the next step?
So what I'm hearing you say is that take the domestic abuse survivors, for example, be faced with that trigger. That's what that's what their body did to keep them safe. So now they're doing that when they are safe. It's their body kind of tricking themselves to do the same thing.
Yeah, this is the brilliant thing about our brains and our bodies is that once something happens like that, maybe one or two times, we're pattern making machines in a way, right? We're looking to know something, know it well enough that we react to it in an efficient way or in a safe way later. So if there's been a trauma, the way that our memories work, and I am by no means an expert on the neuroscience of trauma, so let me just say that right away. But part of the training that I did was sensory motor psychotherapy. They're really great about that. Is that we hold pieces of the memory of the trauma in our brains. And so then if something in our environment looks similar to that, then the trauma response will wake up. So I remember one example I think I had from one of the trainers that let's say that, someone's been mugged, right? And that the person who mugged them had a red sweater, right? And the rest of the memory doesn't necessarily get to be super clear. It can be kind of fuzzy and piecemeal, but like the red sweater thing kind of sticks, right? The next time somebody sees someone in a red sweater, they may have a fight or flight response because the brain remembers that. And so now it's on alert for that particular set of circumstances so that it can keep you safe. Right?
So in your opinion, when this happens, it's not always a good thing. Do you think that you can train your brain or rewire your brain to then not have that trigger response when you see that thing?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because the first part of it is being aware that that's happening, right? And so that's a lot of what we do in therapy, but even what we can do individually. And I would say, this kind of goes back to the culture and the identity piece as well, is that, when we attach meanings to certain things, certain people, certain actions, and it kind of gets ingrained, then we start to form a belief system around those groups, those peoples, those things. If we can interrupt those with curiosity and gathering more information, then that's when we get to interrupt those cycles of trauma response. So if you have a response, to someone in a red sweater, right? And it seemed, that if you can pause in that moment and be like, wait a minute, that person is walking across the street. They're not even making eye contact with me. There's nothing going on there. Why is my heart racing so fast? Right? That's the moment of curiosity. It's like, okay, I wonder what that was. It's like, oh, okay. Now I know because this happened to me with a person in a red sweater. So I'm going to interrupt this right now and not make everybody in a red sweater a danger. But that takes time to do that. Yeah.
Is there ways that, like when you work with clients or patients, or is there ways that you can have them to recognize that? Because I know that sometimes when you're triggered by something, it's hard to know exactly where that trigger's coming from.
Yeah. That's, I think, the beauty of working with the body, because, the brain is trying so hard to make meaning, really to put labels on things and make it quantifiable and logical and, A, B, C, D, that oftentimes we're not quite ready to go into that deeper memory of a trauma. A lot of trauma lives very deeply within us, lives within our bodies, is decontextualized, especially if it's happened when you're very, very young. There's a lot of pre-verbal, abuse that have happened to people, in many instances where there are no words yet. So what I've done with clients is that when those memories start coming up or a sensation starts coming up, we slow it way down, and basically ask the body what it wants to do next. And what I'm looking for in a session in that way is when trauma arises, is there a movement, like, and you can't see me too much, but I'll use my hands a bit. So is there a movement that looks like it's like maybe trying to push, right? 'Cause a lot of times when folks are speaking, our bodies speak along with our words, right? So we're not completely still. So if you notice a movement starting to happen along with a word or with a memory, when we can slow that down and invite the body to do what perhaps it wasn't able to do in that moment of trauma, then everything kind of unlocks. It's what we call movement sequencing. It's sequences, right? So, one example would be if I do see someone kind of doing this, I'm like, what would your hand like to do right now? And it's like, can we stay with the hand? Like, okay. So, all right, what does it want to do next? Well, it wants to do this. All right, let's keep going with that. Does it want something to push against? I'll give a pillow. And so then as that happens, it is amazing to see what happens along with it. Emotions can come. I'll ask, are there any feelings or images that come up? Another image or something could come up around that. And then we stay with that as long as the client is still in present moment with me. The moment it looks like, the memory is taking over or trauma is happening, like it's a re-traumatization, we'll stop, because then it's too much. Mm-hmm. But really, I let the body lead. And through the body, then you find maybe what the interrupted experience was that it wished it could have done in the moment.
Mm-hmm. That's really good, because I feel like, you hear like to kind of refill the trauma, but then there's also this danger of, if I go in and I kind of refill this, well, then what's going to end up happening if I go in too deep and then I'm re-traumatized.
Right.
So I think there's always that balance. And this is probably the positive of working with a professional, because they can do that. But I love the way that you just described that, because it's so true. Watching for those cues of not going too much, getting too traumatized. Yeah. And it was as simple as like not letting those memories take over, like you're still present in the moment. Right. Do you think that that's something people can analyze on of themselves? Like, so say I'm triggered by something, and then I can kind of start to ask my body questions, but can I navigate and know when I'm getting too close to that being re-traumatized borderline?
Yeah, I mean, again, I invite anyone, who, whatever framework works for you. And for me, the window of tolerance is a great framework. And I don't know if you're familiar with that, or if your listeners are. Dr. Dan Siegel created this. And basically it shows, I'm going to be using my hands. It kind of shows like two lines, and within the middle is what he calls his window of tolerance. So this is basically where we're regulated, where our nervous systems are regulated. So it's where we can have thoughts, emotions, sensations kind of all at once. This is where folks might call it being grounded or being present, and we're not always there all the time. So, that's not necessarily, it is a goal, but it's not the goal. So, we're humans, we're always going to be kind of reacting to what's going on in our lives. But when you have trauma, that space gets more narrow. Right. So our ability to be grounded, to be present, to be regulated in our nervous system, which means, having a heart rate that's pretty even, having breathing that's fairly deep, just feeling relaxed, if that's how you want to put it, that's being regulated. So with trauma, it makes that a little bit more difficult to access. And smaller things, like everyday things, could trigger a fight or flight response. So the first place the body goes, according to window of tolerance, when we have a perceived threat, is fight or flight. And that's going to be, I need to run, right? Or I need to fight. And that can come out with emotions, it can be anger, it can be, sadness, it can be just big emotions coming up around that. It's the interesting thing in our bodies, that what happens is that everything starts to shift in order to keep us focused on survival. So we actually get, like, our thoughts get fuzzy. We can't really focus and make decisions, because that's really programmed that way. As he says, it's like, back in the day, if we're being attacked by a tiger, we don't want to be standing there thinking about, do I take 2 steps right and then another one left, and then do I go that way? No. If we're thinking about it too much, we've become lunch for the tiger. So it's like that goes offline, and we are just meant to react. Our blood goes to our extremities. We get adrenaline rush. Our digestive systems even start kind of, slowing down. So you get all of these reactions in your body happening really quick in fight or flight. If that doesn't take care of the threat, then the next place the body goes is to what they call hyporegulation, which is freeze, which is kind of like playing dead. So that's where you get really almost numb. You get dissociated. Your emotions don't feel as strong. They kind of flatten out. And the other part of that, you can do that, what they call fawn or appease, where you become very people pleasing. You want to appear as not a threat. All right. So, I would say, for folks to get curious about maybe some of these frameworks and see where their bodies go. Because for me personally, I don't stay in fight or flight very long. My reaction, my lifelong reaction, was a little bit of that, but then I would really be more in freeze mode, and definitely in fawn mode. So people pleasing became a big coping mechanism for me throughout my life. And I didn't realize that was kind of a chronic trauma response to my environments. So I know I said a whole bunch of stuff right there. So I know it's a lot.
So I'm very interested in this, because I think I think I do the same thing. I think I will go into that freeze or fawn mode. And I've often tried to think back, like, why do I do that? Because it's one of those frustrating things. In the moment, you just do it.
Yeah.
It's just an automatic reaction. But in the later, you look back and you're like, why did I respond that way?
Right.
Why couldn't I speak up for myself? Why couldn't I create those boundaries, like that line in the sand? Why do I do that?
Right.
And it's you can see it very easily when you look back on it. And you can also see very easily how the effects of that is taking over, and like it's detrimental in the long term, like, well, I didn't set that boundary, or I didn't say that, or you'll have people even come to you and say, well, you didn't say that, and you're like, yeah, I know I didn't say that. It's one of these things that I know, speaking for myself, like I can get really frustrated with myself for doing that. So what tips do you have for, like, let's say that someone does feel that, or any of those 4 frameworks, to overcome that? Is that something that you have to look into your trauma and figure out?
Yeah. And it is so complex, and I want to, like, really say, for folks out there, and for ourselves too, again, there's a deep wisdom in what our bodies are doing in these reactions, right? They are keeping us alive. Whether or not it is an actual life-threatening event that's happening, it doesn't matter. For us, it feels like it's life-threatening. So let's be gentle with ourselves, first of all. I know the term self-compassion was really hard for me for a long time, and self-care. I think a lot of caregivers out there, and mental health folks, whenever we hear self-care, we're like, okay, because we're used to taking care of others. So, let's give ourselves that same grace, right? Again, it's like, it goes back to curiosity. And for me, not just on an individual level, yes, it's something that's happened to me, why am I in this pattern? But let's broaden that view too. And this goes into, cultural norms and identities. What is it about me and my identities that perhaps had to do this particular trauma response in order to get what I needed in life, right? So I will say for myself, my identities as being both, a daughter of an immigrant, and also, Native American person in this country, a woman of color, a woman, right? There are so many societal messages that have come towards me that have reinforced the fawn people-pleasing persona, right? If we think about that, right? So for me to be agreeable to society helps me, get what I need. Does that make me feel great internally? No, it's always a conflict internally, right? Because there's parts of me that are disappearing within that adjustment, right? So how do I find my sense of self? How do I find my sense of power? How do I hold my identities in a way that doesn't capitulate to a people pleaser? That's been also a lifelong process, and each moment has to be a moment of decision, right? So when you feel yourself, and I guess maybe this would be the one thing I would say, if you notice yourself going into a trauma response, right, whether that's people pleasing, the fawn, state, or let's say that you are in fight mode a whole lot, right? If that's something that seems like a pattern, again, like, start getting, like, widen your view around it. It's like, okay, I know I'm doing this, but what does this feel linked to for me? Why do I feel like I need to do this? Ask myself that question. Ask my body that question. What would happen if I didn't do this? Right? That's the other piece too. Sometimes we don't even entertain the fact that we have a different way of doing it. So start tracking yourself, right? Start noticing what you do, start tracking yourself, and then start getting curious about, okay, what did I see in my family? What did I see in my community? What are the cultural messages around who I am in my identities that have been asking me to be a certain way? And do I still agree with that? And if the answer is no, then you start exploring other ways of being. And initially that can feel very scary because it can feel dangerous, right? Like, if I speak up in this instance, are people not going to like me? Am I going to be, in danger? And for some folks and some identities, there's a very real reason why we won't do things in certain contexts, where we will be quiet.
So you talk about identities, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
curious about this because I've often thought this, and I'm curious as a therapist what your views are.
Mm-hmm.
But words obviously are super powerful, right?
Yeah.
What we speak matters. What we speak manifests. Let's say you're a kid and your
Mm-hmm.
parents meaning very well. We all
Mm-hmm.
do it as parents. Like we kind of put these stipulations on our kids. That's like you're this or you're that or you're this, and it can be really good things. Like you're really smart, or you're really articulate, or you're really beautiful, or whatever. But how much do these things affect us as, I don't want to say childhood trauma, but it's childhood identification. Like we put these identities, our parents kind of put that on us, and then we feel like we have to live up to that throughout our life.
Yeah. I think across the board, that is a challenge as parents, right? And also, the impact that we have on our children and what we value and what we feel are going to be important for our kids. The tricky part is, if it means so much to us as parents, how do we say it in a way that shows that it means so much to us, but doesn't come across as something that is a should for them, right? So for me, that comes from a space of love and joy and a willingness to share personal kind of experience with that. I can tell you, I feel like my parents did a really good job in terms of not categorizing me and my brother. I have one brother. They unfortunately didn't give us a lot of context to their cultures, but that was the generation as well. So like they didn't bring us up with the language, but they also didn't tell us we had to be a certain way, right? And I remember, I'll give you one instance in which I'm really grateful for my mom for this. My mom and I don't share the same skin tone. I have a darker skin tone than she does. And I think I must have been in grade school when I noticed that. And I said something to her about that. And without skipping a beat, she said, I love your skin tone. I think it's beautiful. And you're my daughter. Period. That's it. That conversation can be had so many different ways with different families with different beliefs around skin tone, right? So I think that's where, as a parent, like whatever your beliefs are, whatever your trauma is, if you can take that pause, take a beat and realize that you have, a child in front of you that is still forming their beliefs about the world, and you are actually their first ambassador to those belief systems. How do you want this child to feel about themselves as they walk through the world? Right?
Which is challenging as a parent.
Very challenging as a parent, and very challenging also when we're competing with social media and so many other sources of information that are telling our kids to be a certain way. And I think about this in terms of body image in particular, given that I'm a body psychotherapist. But if you think about the pressure, not just on women, but everyone along the spectrum of identity, of gender, of how their bodies should look and what they should be, that's tremendous. It's too much pressure. It's far too much pressure. And I'm not just talking about weight. I'm talking about appearance and what your hair should look like and what your eyes should look like and what you know what I mean? Like it's all of that kind of thing. So yeah, it's a lot.
Well, it's hard. It's hard on us as adults. I can only imagine growing up in this day and age what it's like for our kids, and it grieves my heart greatly, actually.
Yeah.
But if we take that, what you just described, and let's flip it to where now, as adults, we're looking back and we're saying, okay, my parents put these identifying factors on me, and being curious, asking myself, where does that come from? Like, because I've tried to do this myself, and I go back and think of things. My parents were young when they had me, so they were great parents. I'm not discounting that. They said great things about me. They always told me how smart I was, how pretty I was, all these things. But I believe in myself, like it put pressure to where, as I got older, it was like, I always have to live up to these things because that's part of my identity.
Yeah.
And I think that's been a struggle. I can't relate to other people's experience growing up, but I just wonder how much of that feeds into the identity that we adopt as we move forward into life, into our adulthood, and throughout our life.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you're bringing this up because there are so many different factors in how we learn about ourselves throughout our lifetimes, right? It's very easy to go back and say, it's all my parents' fault, or it's all, society's fault, or it's all my fault, right? A lot of times kids are going to bring that on themselves too. I was one of those kids that took over responsibility for other people's feelings. I felt like I had to mediate things and make sense of things, and if everybody was okay, then I'd be okay. That was sort of my mode. We are a combination of so many different things, and again, not just in this lifetime, but all the lifetimes that have come before us. I mean, really think about that for a moment. Our parents are products of their parents, who are products of their parents, and on and on and on, right? And everyone was a product of their time. So it's not just, behavior in isolation. It's never that, We live within a period of time that has its own ebbs and flows, of what can be spoken to and what isn't spoken to, of what's valued, what's not valued. And sometimes these societal shifts can happen very quickly, as we're seeing now. Like, my kids' generation, like they're in their 20s, they've seen probably more social change in this country than I think I saw, as I was growing up in my 20s, for sure. So we're all faced with the particular challenges of the times that we're growing up. I think what might be different now is that folks are asking more questions about it, not just about what's happened, but what it means to them. And in a healing context, how can I heal from this, right? So perhaps what would have taken generations for folks to actually bring to light and want to heal in terms of a family, pattern, or intergenerational trauma, or even a history or whatever. Right now, there's so much more information available, not only through genealogy and things like that, like we see on the shows about people discovering more things about their ancestors. But there's a real willingness, I think, for folks to interrupt intergenerational trauma so that they don't pass it on. That is something uniformly that I've seen, not only in clients that I've worked with, but in students that I work with my kids and their friends. They speak about mental health very directly. They've all experienced it, dramatically experienced it, so it's not taboo, right? So I think whatever we're born with, and this is where I get kind of into my own, I think, spiritual belief, is something that we were meant to have so that we could grow and change and develop as, as a being on this planet during this time, right? So in some ways, I believe we choose our path. And if we're willing to engage with the lessons and grow from that, then it's not just about us. We're actually healing those around us, those that came before us, and those that come after us.
Yeah, I'm actually completely in agreement with that.
Mm-hmm.
I think so too. And I think that there's a fulfillment that comes with that as well. Once you find purpose and you realize that the things that's happened to me are not my identity, they are just things that's happened, and how I navigate those things. We get the power to choose. We can choose if we navigate them like in a toxic way, or do we navigate them in a healthy way, or what's the in between? Because there's all kinds of, notches on the line in between that.
Yeah.
But I think we get to choose, and then we get to determine how is this going to help progress not only my own healing, but how is it going to impact those around me? And this is where my belief system comes in, where I believe that I don't think anything's wasted. Yeah. I think that God allows things to happen to us, not that he necessarily causes it to happen, but when these things happen, how can we use that to not only grow ourselves, but to impact others?
Right.
Because we're all on this earth together. Yeah. So it's a matter of like, one person can experience something that could help me further along in my path, and I could experience something totally different that could help them along in their path.
Right. What you're speaking to is really about empathy, and this is the thing about trauma, is that through suffering, we develop empathy if we're willing to go there, right? A lot of times trauma can shut off, and necessarily does shut off feelings, until we're ready to get to those in a safer space. But if you think about it, everybody has experienced some level of suffering. You just can't escape it in this world, right? And the degrees of which we experience that suffering can be massive, and they can be quiet and small. They can be momentary, they can be chronic, right? But every moment of that is an opportunity to understand that someone else also has experienced that. Maybe not the particular event, but the feeling of being unsafe, the feeling of being hurt, the feeling of being in suffering. And that's where we develop empathy, right? So I do want to say that, identity is very important. It gives us what helps us understand our world. Each culture, each identity has worldviews, and it helps us be who we are in a fully realized way. It's not easy for everyone. Some identities are more difficult to have than others in certain contexts. And I think having a multicultural identity, which is what I write about, has its own particular set of challenges, because we're trying to be 100% of everything, and at the same time, not part of anything, right? So there's a sense of wanting to belong and a sense of knowing that for me personally, that I never will belong fully in any one place. But that also offers us the opportunity for choice, as you're saying. So it's like, do I have to give up all of my identities in order to belong? No, I don't need to do that. So then what is it that I want to do? I want to become more fluid in that. This is me speaking, right? So then how do I do that? You widen out your range of possibility. So identity is important so that we know who we are as we come into the world, right? How it grows and shifts with us is also very important, to allow it to do that, but also how to recognize that in others as not being a dangerous thing. I think right now diversity is attached with a negative connotation, and it actually should never have a negative connotation, because if you look in our environment, diversity is absolutely necessary for us to live. We have to have different trees and grass and in earth, and that's diversity. That's the same way with humans. We're not all the same. And in our differences, we can find beautiful ways of learning and growing if we engage with each other with an open heart to do so. And with an understanding that even though another identity is experiencing pain and suffering in a particular way, I can understand that through my empathy, because I've also suffered in a particular way, right? That's where we can connect with each other. I think right now there's such a move for people staying within their groups that we're forgetting that the real human potential comes when we cross that bridge with another group and really join hands in that way, right? That's when we ease suffering, when we can extend our care to folks that don't have the same lived experience as us, when we can feel their emotions. That's what therapy is. I'm not the same as any of my clients. Even if they may be people of color, we all have different experiences. And I want to know their experiences. I want to hear them. I want to provide a safe space so that whatever healing wants to arise in that safe space has a welcoming environment to do so. That's my objective, And
it's so beautiful what you just said too, because it is true. Like, if we can embrace that uniqueness of what makes us us and value and appreciate other people for their uniqueness, I mean, that is the crux of growth. If you cannot meet someone where they're at, like, there's so many things that I could learn from you, you could learn from me, we could learn from other, it's beautiful. But it's like so many times, and this could be a whole nother episode for a whole nother day, but we do have an issue, I feel like, in this country where they have made diversity or uniqueness like it's a bad thing. The media will try to pit people that are different from each other against each other, but that's a problem. I tell people I'm very open about my faith, but I also love sitting down with people of opposite faiths, because I'm like, I want to know what you've experienced. I want to know what makes you believe what you believe. I mean, it has opened my mind up to a lot of things that, being raised in Southern, like, Bible Belt, like, there's many things that is not biblical. You think it's taught,
right.
but I live in the Bible Belt, but it's not biblical.
Right.
And, I wouldn't know that if I didn't sit down with other people that challenged my belief systems in those ways.
Yeah.
So it's a beautiful thing, and I think that it's part of the human existence,
Mm-hmm.
and it's part of growing and becoming your best self. You go and you explore and you find and you embrace curiosity and embrace uniqueness, aside from just believing because other people tell you it's true, or you just what your family said. That, to me, that's a generational curse. 'Cause it's like,
Yeah. And I mean, and think about this too. It's like we are all humans coming from different experiences, but I think trying to explain the same thing. It's like, why am I here? That is at the root of so much of our experience. What is my purpose, right? Who am I? These are fundamental questions that we all try to answer, whether that's through spirituality, through our work, through our relationships. Do I matter? Like that question, is that really like, do people see me? Am I validated? Am I appreciated? Am I actually here? you know, a lot of trauma comes from feeling negated, from feeling othered, from feeling invisible, right? We want to matter, right? And so I think when we open ourselves up to having these conversations with folks that have different worldviews, I think anyway, I learn how people answer those questions in ways that I would have never even thought. Beautiful ways, right? Like, how does someone engage with their spirituality? How does someone engage with their identity? What does it mean for someone to be, for me, like, what does it mean for someone to be Native American or Brazilian or multicultural? Like, tell me your story, because it's different than mine. And now I feel less alone, right? Because these experiences can feel very isolating if you don't know if you share them with others. But we don't know unless we actually ask, right?
That's right. Or unless someone decides to take the initiative and speak. I'm really big on that.
Yeah.
I think that it's so important for people to share their stories because, you don't know what someone's been through. You don't know what their childhood's like. You don't know what makes them make the decisions that they make until they, when they start to talk, it's like, oh, you've been through this thing. And I mean, that's where I've got a lot of my empathy is just hearing people and really being able to put myself in their shoes or try to put myself in their shoes. I don't think you ever can really, but try to put myself in their shoes and say, hey, you know what, you've been through this. I don't know how I'd react if I had this trauma or that trauma or, we don't know.
And I think in the retelling, sometimes they surprise themselves with knowing how they survived that. I think that's the other part that's really important with trauma is that, oftentimes people want to keep it in silence, right? And that's where the wound never gets healed. So whether you find a therapist or whether you find a trusted friend or can have that conversation with your parents, right? Or whatever it is, if you can bring the trauma out of silence, then it has the opportunity to be witnessed and you're not carrying it alone anymore. And invariably, somebody's going to have experienced something that's similar, or if they haven't, they're going to feel the pain of what it meant to you to carry it, right? And that lightens the load a little bit, I think.
Yeah, for sure. I think so too.
Yeah.
I think that's the power of community and the power of fellowship with other human beings. But I know we're getting close to like the hour. I want to give you an opportunity to share with my audience. Its conversations go by so fast.
I know, that went by so fast. Oh my gosh, I could have kept going forever.
I know. And I could have continued to just ask you questions forever. You're very knowledgeable. And, I want you to talk to my audience a little bit about where people can find you should they want to get involved in everything that you're doing.
Yeah.
And then also tell us a little bit about your book and where we can find that as well.
Okay. Well, if I can, I have my book here. So it is Movement and Identity, Multiculturalism, Somatic Awareness, and Embodied Code Switching. The publisher, Stinging Dragon, they did a beautiful job with the art. I just love it. I just want to do a shout out to that. The book was really a labor of love. I feel like I was called by my ancestors to write it. It is how can I put this? It's got my personal writing in it. It's got professional, expertise in there. It's got research. I wanted folks to be able to engage with this topic of being multicultural and what does that mean in terms of cultural identities, but also what does it mean to be embodied in those identities and finding choice and finding agency and understanding what it means to really tap into the resilience of all of your lineages. So in many ways, this book is, I guess, my way of inviting folks to be in touch with themselves, to learn what it means to be human for themselves so that they can extend that empathy and that sense of belonging to others. It's got great illustrations in it. I wanted it to be a way for people to engage with the material that didn't feel like a textbook necessarily, but felt like an invitation to hear my voice go through and guide them as they want to go on this journey with me. I am currently teaching at Naropa University. I'm going to start seeing private practice clients again. I paused so that I could write the book, but I'm also doing supervision. So I'm located in Boulder, Colorado. But I also work with the intercultural communications field too, and hopefully we'll be doing more work internationally that way. And so people can find me through my website, which is marciabonatowarren.com. And the book is available on Amazon, all the online booksellers. You can get them hopefully through your local bookstores. I hope they're doing that too, because I love to support the local bookstores, as well as directly through the publisher at Singing Dragon. So, and there's a great deal in there about trauma, because that is part of identity, and about culture, identity, embodied code switching, which is my work, which describes it's a movement and awareness practice of how we proactively switch between our cultures. So
I love it. So it's filled with jam-packed with a bunch of stuff
yes.
that you need to
yes.
navigate through your trauma.
Yes.
So I know a lot of times there's many different ways that you can get involved in figuring out your trauma, but sometimes books are one of the fastest, quickest, cheapest ways to get involved and to try to navigate through some of your trauma alone in the comfort of your own home. So I always love when I have authors that come on here and share about their book, because you've literally taken all of your expertise and jam-packed it into this book for people to read. Get a copy of the book. Check that out.
Oh, I'm also on social media too. So I'm on Facebook and LinkedIn and Instagram. So you can find me with my name. So
yeah. And are those linked to your website?
Yes, they are.
Yeah. So just go to her website and find everything out about her and all of the work that she's done. We barely scratched the surface here because there's so much. Someone that has been in mental health therapy for years upon years, it's hard to jam pack everything.
True.
But hopefully this gives you a little glimpse.
Yeah.
So why don't you tell us a big takeaway or something that you really want to leave our audience with that could help them on their path to wholeness and healing and just navigating through trauma? What would that be?
That although trauma feels like it is a huge challenge and can put you in a dark place, that there is always a light, and that the resilience that comes from surviving trauma, the lessons that it gives you, always will lead towards growth. But you can't do it alone. So reach out, find someone, find a therapist, find a friend, find a family member. Don't try to go it alone. Do it with someone. And that's the path to healing.
And healing is key. And we live in a time and a culture where healing is so important.
Yes.
For the reasons that we spoke about today and so many other reasons. So thank you so much for coming on and just sharing with us and taking the time out of your day to feed us with all of your expertise. And I love your work. I love what you're doing. And thank you so much for your heart behind it all.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, and it's been wonderful talking with you. And I just send a big hug out to everyone who's listening. So thanks so much.
Hey there, friend. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for spending this time here with us on Through the Trauma podcast. Your presence means more than you know. If this episode has spoke to you or gave you hope or made you feel just a little bit less alone, then I would love it if you would take a second, subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who truly needs to hear it. Every share, every comment, every listen, it all helps our message get out and reach those who truly need it the most. Healing happens inside of a community, and together we are breaking the silence and creating space for transformation. Thank you so much for being a part of this journey. Until next time, be gentle with yourself. You are not alone.